The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was Ranger barking. Now, Ranger wasn't much of a barker. 12-year-old blue heeler, half-deaf, lazy as a government employee after lunch. Most days he'd barely lift his head when I came home from trucking run. But that evening, the second I stepped out of my rig, he was standing near the porch growling toward the back of the house like somebody had broken into the place. I remember tossing my duffel bag onto the porch and laughing. "What you worked up about, old man?" Then I walked inside. That's when I heard it. Nothing. No water running through the pipes. No pressure hum. No familiar rattle in the old farmhouse walls. Just silence. I turned the kitchen faucet. Nothing. Turn it harder. Still nothing. A dry metallic cough echoed through the pipe, and that was it. After 14 hours hauling freight from Oklahoma back into southern Kansas, I wasn't exactly in the mood for surprises. I just stood there staring at the sink while Ranger sat beside me watching my face. Then I spotted the notice taped to the back window. Bright orange. Official looking. The kind of document designed to make ordinary people immediately feel guilty before they even read it. I pulled it down and started reading. My stomach tightened. According to the notice, my private water source had been permanently decommissioned under a newly revised infrastructure compliance initiative. Permanently decommissioned. That's a fancy way of saying somebody had just destroyed my well. I headed straight for the basement. By that point, I was still trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe a busted pressure switch. Maybe a collapsed pipe. Then I opened the maintenance hatch, and my heart dropped. Concrete. Solid gray concrete. The entire well casing had been filled from top to bottom. For a second, I couldn't even think. I just stared. That well wasn't some random utility. My grandfather dug it in 1937. By hand. During years when people around here were abandoning farms because they couldn't survive. Growing up, I heard the story 100 times. Grandpa Eli spent nearly a week digging with borrowed tools and pure stubbornness. When he finally struck water, he supposedly sat in the dirt and cried because it meant his family could stay on the land. My father drank from that well. I drank from that well. Every county inspection for decades came back clean. Actually cleaner than municipal water most years. And now somebody had buried it under concrete while I was out making a living. I sat on an overturned bucket in the basement for probably 20 minutes just trying to process what I was looking at. Eventually, only one name kept popping into my head. Heather Voss, president of the Willow Ridge Community Association. The woman who had spent the last 4 years trying to turn the countryside into a gated brochure. Now here's the thing. I didn't even live inside Willow Ridge. My farm sat right beside it. 6 acres of old family land surrounded on 3 sides by a subdivision that hadn't existed 15 years earlier. Developers bought former cattle pasture and packed it full of oversized houses, decorative stone walls, and enough HOA regulations to control the angle of sunlight, if they could figure out how. At first, nobody bothered me. Then property values started climbing. Suddenly, my old red barn became an eyesore. My chicken coop became a concern. My stacked firewood became a visual issue. Every few months, another letter showed up. Another complaint. Another request. Another suggestion that maybe I'd be happier if I modernized. Heather always delivered those messages with the same smile. The kind that never quite reached her eyes. 3 months before the well incident, she had actually shown up at my fence line, carrying a clipboard. I still remember the conversation. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "the board has concerns regarding your independent utility systems." I laughed. What does that even mean? Your private well. My grandfather built that well before your subdivision existed. Communities evolve. I remember looking at her and thinking that was one of the most dangerous sentences I'd ever heard. Communities evolve. Because what people like Heather really mean is simple. You evolve, or we'll make life uncomfortable until you do. Standing in my basement, staring at that concrete-filled well, I realized something. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paperwork. Somebody had crossed a line. And before the sun went down that evening, I intended to find out exactly who. The next morning, I climbed into my truck and drove toward town, angry enough that I barely remembered the trip. I didn't know it yet, but before that week was over, the entire Willow Ridge subdivision was about to discover something they had completely overlooked for years. They thought they controlled the neighborhood. What they didn't realize was that one of the most important systems keeping their community alive sat on my land. And I held the keys. The next morning, I drove into town before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. I headed straight for the concrete contractor listed on a faded service sticker I'd found near what used to be my well casing. The office sat behind an old farm supply store, the kind of place that smelled like diesel fuel, dust, and stale cigarettes. A bell rattled over the door when I walked in. The foreman looked up from behind a cluttered desk. Big guy, gray beard, weathered hands. The second he saw the expression on my face, I think he already knew why I was there. "You Rick?" "Depends who's asking." I tossed the service sticker onto his desk. His shoulders dropped. "Yeah, I'm Rick." I pointed toward the sticker. "Who authorized the concrete pour on my property?" For a moment, he just stared at it. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. That wasn't the reaction of a man confident he had done the right thing. Finally, he sighed. "Look, man, we were told it was approved." "By who?" "The HOA." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably stupid. "The HOA doesn't own my property." "I know that now." That answer got my attention. Now, meaning he hadn't known before. Rick explained that Heather Voss and 2 board members had shown up with documents claiming the county wanted the well decommissioned due to contamination concerns. According to him, they acted like everything was routine. Official. Urgent. Already approved. Nobody verified anything. Nobody contacted me. Nobody checked county records. They simply showed up with enough confidence to make everybody assume they were telling the truth. Then Rick said something that flipped a switch in my brain. "Honestly, we figured you'd just hook into city water and move on." Move on. Like somebody knocked over a mailbox. Like they hadn't just erased nearly 90 years of family history. I stood up before I said something I'd regret. Rick followed me toward the door. "Look, for what it's worth, I think they crossed a line." I stopped, turned around. "You have any idea how much a man thinks about revenge during 14 hours alone in a truck?" Rick didn't answer, probably because he knew exactly what I meant. I drove home angrier than I'd been in years. The entire way back, I kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Heather. Every complaint, every warning, every little condescending smile. Then, halfway down my gravel road, something caught my eye. A chain-link fence, small utility building, county infrastructure, the wastewater lift station. I slowed the truck, and suddenly a memory surfaced. 22 years earlier, long before Willow Ridge existed, county engineers came asking permission to install a regional wastewater transfer station on a corner of my property. The location was perfect, lowest elevation in the valley. Everything naturally flowed downhill toward it. At the time, it seemed harmless. Tiny building, minimal traffic, steady lease payments. Everybody won. I parked and sat there staring through the windshield. The more I thought about it, the more details came back. The lease, the access agreements, the maintenance provisions. Then one particular clause hit me like lightning. Primary site access remained under landowner authority except under declared emergency conditions. I hadn't thought about that contract in years. Honestly, I'd almost forgotten it existed. But now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I climbed out of the truck and walked toward the fence. The station hummed quietly behind locked gates. Just another piece of infrastructure most people never notice. But I knew what passed through those pumps. Every shower, every dishwasher, every washing machine, every toilet, every gallon of wastewater from Willow Ridge eventually traveled through that little building. And for the first time, I realized something. The entire subdivision depended on a system they didn't understand. A system sitting on my property. A system they never bothered to think about. Kind of like they never bothered thinking about my well. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun drop behind the fields. Ranger stretched out beside me. I wasn't planning anything yet. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But anger does strange things when it mixes with helplessness. Most people think revenge starts with rage. It doesn't. It starts with powerlessness. It starts when somebody takes something from you and acts like you're supposed to accept it. By midnight, I had pulled every document related to the lift station from an old filing cabinet. The original lease, the amendments, county correspondence, inspection reports. I spent hours reading, and the more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because of what I found, because of what I didn't find. No emergency override authorization. No permanent county easement. No provision allowing unrestricted access. The agreement was far more dependent on landowner cooperation than anyone apparently remembered, especially Willow Ridge. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, made coffee, walked across the pasture. Fog hung low over the grass. Everything felt strangely calm. The lift station sat ahead of me. Quiet. Ordinary. The kind of place nobody notices until it stops working. I unlocked the gate. Stepped inside. The hum of industrial pumps echoed through the building. Steady. Reliable. Invisible. Kind of like my well had been. I stood there staring at the master disconnect panel. Big red handle. Simple. One movement. That's all it would take. For a second, I actually hesitated. Because despite everything, I wasn't a reckless person. I'd spent most of my life solving problems, not creating them. Then I remembered the concrete, the orange notice, the arrogance, the assumption that I'd simply comply, and something hardened inside me. I pulled the disconnect. The humming stopped instantly. Silence. Complete silence. I removed the handle, slipped it into my jacket pocket, locked everything back up, then walked home. At first, nothing happened. That was the funny part. People assume disaster arrives immediately. Most systems fail slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through glass. Around lunchtime, my phone started buzzing. County maintenance alerts, network failures, communication errors. Nothing dramatic. Yet, by mid-afternoon, local neighborhood groups started lighting up online. Anyone else having drainage issues? Toilets making weird noises? Slow sinks? Bad smell near the clubhouse? By dinner time, things got interesting. Videos started appearing. Overflowing drains. Backed up showers. Residents arguing in comment sections. Plumbers crawling through yards. Nobody understood what was happening. Because from inside their homes, everything looked normal. The problem wasn't inside individual houses. The problem was underneath the entire community. And underneath the community sat a silent pump station, waiting. By the next morning, Willow Ridge was in full panic mode. People were posting photos of bubbling toilets, overflowing bathtubs, foul water backing into laundry rooms. One video showed a homeowner screaming while gray sludge erupted through a basement drain. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I laughed. Not because families were suffering, because for the first time, the people who never thought about infrastructure were being forced to see it. The invisible suddenly became visible. And that was only the beginning, because by the afternoon of day 2, the smell arrived. And once the smell arrived, there was no hiding the crisis anymore. By the afternoon of day 2, the smell had settled over Willow Ridge like a storm cloud nobody could outrun. You could almost track the panic by watching social media. The first day, people were confused. The second day, they were angry. By the third day, they were desperate. The country club restaurant shut down after drainage issues hit the kitchen. The fitness center closed. Portable toilets appeared near the subdivision entrance. Families started staying with relatives in neighboring towns. Realtors canceled home showings. Contractors lined the streets looking exhausted and confused. And every expert who inspected the problem came back with the same conclusion. The issue wasn't inside the homes. The issue was somewhere upstream. Or in this case, downstream. That afternoon, 3 county officials pulled into my driveway, along with a sheriff's deputy. I met them on the porch. Sweet tea in one hand. Ranger asleep at my feet. The oldest inspector spoke first. "Mr. Dalton, we need immediate access to the wastewater station." I nodded. "Do you?" His jaw tightened. "This situation is becoming a public health concern." Funny thing about emergencies. Nobody cares much about them until they're personally affected. I pointed toward the folder sitting beside my chair. My well was a pretty serious concern, too. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then I handed over photographs. The concrete-filled casing. The damage. The contractor statements. Copies of property records. The deputy looked through the photos and quietly muttered something under his breath. The inspectors exchanged uncomfortable glances. For the first time, somebody besides me was acknowledging how badly the situation had started. Eventually, the younger inspector asked the obvious question. What do you want? That was the first honest question anybody had asked since this mess began. Before I could answer, another vehicle turned into the driveway. Black SUV. Heather Voss. The second she stepped out, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished neighborhood queen. Gone was the perfect posture, the confident smile, the immaculate appearance. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. 3 board members followed her up the walkway. Nobody looked happy. Heather stopped at the edge of the porch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she finally said it. We need to resolve this. I leaned back in my chair. That's a different tone than last time we talked. Her face tightened. Not anger. Humiliation, which honestly looked worse. One of the board members stepped forward. People are suffering. I looked at him, then at Heather, then back at him. So am I. The silence that followed felt heavy. Not because nobody had a response, because everybody knew it was true. Heather eventually sat down across from me. The fight had finally reached the point where pretending wasn't useful anymore. No lawyers, no threats, she said quietly. Tell us what it takes. I had spent 3 days thinking about that answer. Maybe longer if I was being honest. I handed her a folder. Inside were my conditions. Full replacement of the destroyed well. Professional drilling. Modern filtration equipment. Compensation for damages. Written exemption protecting my independent water system from future interference. Coverage of legal expenses. And a revised lease agreement for the wastewater station. Higher payments. Long-term guarantees. Clear protections. The board members nearly choked when they saw the numbers. One of them actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because he couldn't believe I was serious. Then he looked around, thought about the subdivision, the overflowing drains, the collapsing property values, the reporters, the angry residents, and the laughter disappeared. Heather read every page without speaking. When she finished, she slowly closed the folder. You planned this. I shook my head. No, you planned this. That landed harder than any insult could have. Because deep down she knew exactly what I meant. Nobody forced them onto my property. Nobody forced them to destroy my well. Every consequence after that traced back to a decision they made. Not me. For nearly another week, negotiations dragged on. Lawyers got involved. County officials got involved. Insurance companies started asking uncomfortable questions. The deeper everyone dug, the uglier things became. Turns out confidence is a poor substitute for legal authority. Eventually, reality won. 3 weeks after the crisis started, everybody met at a small roadside hotel conference room outside county limits. Technically, it was the nearest building with fully functioning plumbing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Nobody smiled. Nobody threatened lawsuits. Nobody talked about community standards. They simply signed. Every page, every condition, every agreement. By that point, everyone just wanted the nightmare to end. 2 months later, drilling crews arrived at my farm. The replacement well ended up producing cleaner water than the original one. The filtration system cost more than my first house. The revised agreements protected the property for years. Life slowly returned to normal. At least mostly. Willow Ridge eventually recovered too. New landscaping, new management, new board members, fresh marketing campaigns. People moved on. That's what communities do. But every now and then I'll drive past the entrance and see those perfect lawns stretching beneath decorative stone signs talking about harmony and neighborhood values. And I can't help smiling, because buried underneath all that perfection is a lesson nobody there will ever forget. The funny thing is, the older I get, the less this story feels like revenge, and the more it feels like a warning. Power has a strange way of convincing people they're smarter than they really are. Give somebody a title, a committee, a rule book, and enough people willing to nod along, and eventually they start confusing authority with wisdom. Heather's biggest mistake wasn't destroying my well. It was assuming independence meant weakness. She looked at an old farmhouse and saw someone easy to ignore. What she didn't see was the network of systems underneath everything. The things that quietly keep communities alive. Water, electricity, drainage, infrastructure. The stuff most people never think about until it disappears. And maybe that's why this story still sparks arguments whenever people hear it. Some folks think I went too far. Others think I didn't go far enough. Truthfully, there are days when I still wrestle with that question myself. Because innocent families got caught in the middle. Kids got caught in the middle. And that's never something to celebrate. But consequences have a way of teaching lessons that warnings never can. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered someone destroyed a piece of your family's history, something your grandfather built with his own hands, would you have handled it differently? Was Heather a victim of her own arrogance? Or did Willow Ridge earn every uncomfortable day that followed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to hear where you stand on this one. And if you've ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or some local authority push too far and finally get pushed back, share that story too. Trust me, sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the real ones.